Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you are in the world. And thank you for joining this Security Boulevard Roundtable. My name is Cody, and welcome back to Techstrong Learning. Before we dive into our discussion today, I have just a couple of notes I'd like to review with everyone. First of all, we are recording today's session. So if you miss any of our conversation, if you'd like to revisit our conversation, or if you'd like to share this conversation with your team, you will be receiving an email with a link to access the recording, and you'll get that recording shortly after we conclude this live session today. If you'd like to get involved, there are a couple of ways to do so. The first way to engage with us is to use the chat tab on the right side of your screen. So if you see that chat tab, I'd like you to let us know from where in the world you are joining us from today. If you have any specific questions, we do want you to direct those questions to the Q&A tab, which is directly on the right side of that chat section. Finally, we will be selecting 2 of our most engaged attendees to receive a $50 Amazon gift card. So ways to become eligible is to send in chats, comments, questions, and of course to fill out our post-webinar survey. So thank you once again, everyone, for joining us. Our topic today is API security. And I'm joined today by Jeremy Ventura, Field CISO at ThreatX, Scott Gerlach, CSO and co-founder of Stackhawk, and leading our conversation today is our very own Mike Vizard, Chief Content Officer here at Techstrong Group. Jeremy and Scott, welcome back to Techstrong Learning. Thank you for joining us. Mike, would you like to go ahead and take it from here?
Yeah, absolutely. Let's get started, folks. Jeremy, let's start with you. At least I feel we talked about API security multiple times over the last few years. And I always had a feeling of a theoretical construct, right? There was going to be somebody who someday could attack these things and, we should watch out. I feel like in the last year, attacks have been launched and these are suddenly becoming more serious and there's a lot more of them. But is that just my perception? Is this kind of like, we're just getting more coverage of it, or is the reality changing?
No, you're absolutely right, Mike. First of all, thank you for having myself, Scott. Look forward to this conversation as well. I know it's near and dear to both of our hearts, but you're exactly right, Mike. Over the last 12 to 18 months, we've seen an explosion of API security incidents facing and challenging organizations around the world of all different sizes, all different industries. And there's a lot to do with that. I think the first and foremost is just in general, in the way we operate and we drive revenue and the way organizations conduct business, a lot of the things that we're doing this via an API, which is really the connective tissue or the glue between how applications work. Whether it is checking your phone and seeing, what is the weather location for my for where I'm currently situated, or if I want to use Apple Pay to pay for my Starbucks coffee in the morning, right? Everything we're doing in the back end is all via these API transactions. Actually, a really interesting stat is around 80% of all internet traffic nowadays is an API call. And so that just goes to show you that APIs are being leveraged and used by organizations, but the point of our conversation, they're also being leveraged by hackers and attackers attacking organizations. So you're absolutely right. We're seeing this proliferation and explosion of API usage, but also incidents that are facing organizations.
Scott, are you seeing the same thing? And do we even recognize when our APIs are attacked? Because sometimes I feel like, business logic is being manipulated in ways that people don't recognize or understand is an attack.
Yeah, we're seeing the same thing. If you talk about, Jeremy just mentioned, companies are creating value by creating APIs, and DevOps and cloud technologies have really enabled engineering teams to do that very quickly. You're talking about all the value is in an API. So hopefully we're not the first ones letting attackers know that that's where they should be attacking in APIs. And it's actually a thing that is happening. Otherwise, shame on us. But that's where all the value is for the company. So therefore the value for the attacker is in the API as well. And, I think there's a ton of work to be able to do there to make this fast and valuable to an organization and understand, there's more than one kind of attack. It's not just business logic. Yes, that one's tough, but there's also classic inject as well. So all of this, like, how do APIs work and how can you test them and how can you protect them and monitor them is all new, but is, I think we'll talk about later, is semi-related to legacy application.
Well, yeah, let's jump into that right now because, Jeremy, I'll throw this your way. I feel like historically application security never got the attention it deserved because The security people spent the money on stuff they control, so they spent their money on the network perimeter and the endpoint, and they assumed the developers were doing something about application security. And of course, the developers assumed that the security people were doing something about application security, and nobody did anything about it. And now we have API security, which I would argue is the redheaded stepchild of application security, because nobody's focused on it at all. So is it finally getting the respect it deserves in a Rodney Dangerfield kind of, we're going to answer all this question?
Whether it's Rodney Dangerfield, or I even like to use that Spider-Man meme where all the Spider-Man are looking at each other pointing, like, whose responsibility? That's what I always reference to. You hit a lot of good points there, Mike. I think from just the industry and the field in general, application security is still very, very relevant. And, there's been a whole argument where is API security part of DevSecOps? Is it a subset of application security? And everyone's got different opinions on that. But in general, I think Scott could agree with me. We both work for security vendors and provide solutions, and this space can be really complex. And there's a lot of vendors. There's a lot of vendors saying they do different things. Maybe there's vendors that do SaaS technologies or API protection or web application firewalls or DAS, and a little bit of Scott's world, I know he can talk about. But I think with that all being said, is we still have a long way to go with application security. But we got to think about, what are applications? What do they do? Every application, for the most part, either uses or leverages an API or is an API in itself. And so when we think about how these applications communicate, how they connect, to Scott's point, how they send, whether it's sensitive data, PHI data, PII data, sensitive information, we need to be able to make sure that we're protecting how those applications work, but how they're communicating with other applications as well. So there's a lot of topics we can talk about here, but I always go back to that Spider-Man meme, or to your reference of the Rodney Dangerfield, where we still have a long way to go. I think we've seen different reports come out, whether it's Gartner, Forrester, other third parties come out and saying web applications, API security is a real threat. However, I think we're still seeing organizations still struggle to either gain buy-in to get these tools and processes and programs in place, or it's the telltale sign of, well, we haven't had an API security incident yet, so maybe we don't need to protect it. And that's something legacy that we've seen over and over and over in security. So I think we have a long way to go. But Scott, I don't know if you've got the same experience that I just mentioned there.
Yeah, I think as to the respect issue, and to Mike's point, where everyone's like, whose responsibility is it? I think where application and API security kind of get stuck in the weeds is thinking about who does it, right? And how it gets done and where information goes. And the thing that I like to say around our company is application is right in the first word of API. Application programming interface. So, it's all kind of related. It's just they work a little bit differently. But I think the thing that happens is when our development and security teams don't work together on what's happening around APIs and applications, that's when you start getting Spider-Man meme. And that's when nothing gets done, is people aren't working together on, what are we building? How does it drive value in the company? What threats are happening against it? And what should we be targeting to work on or fix or protect? And when you don't do that, then really nothing happens, because everyone's like, security teams, if they're not working with their engineering teams, are getting overloaded with alerts and what should I be worried about and protecting? And then they end up in ticket land, and they're like, okay, I got to try to get somebody to do something with the ticket somewhere. And the engineering team's like, hey man, get off our plate. We're trying to make value over here. So that combining of those resources and teams is really important to making any of this happen, like really working together and collaborating.
I feel like the debate goes this way, in my experience, is depending on the vendor and where they started from. If I have an application security platform, they are like insistent that API security is part of application security. And if I have a vendor who is responsible for only API security, they are equally insistent that we need a dedicated API platform. Are the customers getting caught up in this? Because it seems to me there's a certain amount of appeal to thinking that if I invest in an app security platform, that I'm also covered for APIs, because then I'll tell myself that my costs will be lower. But does that really work? Jeremy, what do you think?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. We see that every day. And so I think with that being said, there's just a lot of solutions out there that were really good 8-10 years ago, right? They served a purpose, right? A lot of them were signature based, right? Or what we call legacy signatures. They're only acting on things that they know are good or bad. But we've seen attackers get smarter, right? They're probing networks. They're doing more reconnaissance. They're targeting your organization right now. And it may not be an active attack, but you don't see them because you don't have visibility. You don't have the right tooling in place. You don't have the right sensors or whatever it might be, mechanisms to go and actually track attackers. And I think there's a lot of application vendors out there, or I'll call it legacy solutions, that have included API security, but it's not necessarily looking at kind of the behavioral tactics and techniques or how attackers are evolving their patterns as well. And so there's a challenge, again, kind of going back to my original point, where this entire space sometimes can be a little complex. Where do I go and buy a dedicated security tool to do X, Y, and Z? Or do I rely on a vendor, a massive vendor that does a little bit of everything, but maybe that little bit of everything is not necessarily the best protections? And so there's a balance there. I think every organization, there's a couple of things first, and kind of going into little recommendations. The first thing when looking for security tooling is understanding, as a security leader, as engineering, DevSecOps, is understanding the APIs and applications I have, the risk behind that. So if, for example, an application went down, and that application could be your website, your main page, if that went down, what would be the impact to my business for potential brand damage, to revenue, reputation, or revenue loss? And what does that mean for my supply chain? What does that mean for my other partners? What does that mean for my consumers? Understanding your landscape, the visibility, the discoverability of all that, and then what that actually means part of business context. And then once you have a good understanding, figuring out where do I place, or what is the best solution or solutions for me, as far as I develop my code, I develop my microservices, I develop my applications and test, all the way to what's actually happening in real-time production and real-time threats as well.
All right. Scott, what's your take on this? Are these legitimate conversations vendors are trying to have, or is there a certain amount of I'm just covering my flank here and hoping that nobody spends money on something that might take money away from me?
I think API security, it's still in its kind of infancy as a market, and it's super confusing. Like, even I get confused sometimes. It's super confusing whether you're talking about kind of that big API security umbrella, or what Jeremy's working on is operational intelligence and activity and detect respond capabilities, and what we're working on, which is testing to make sure that you're publishing strong APIs. It gets a little confusing, and that's mostly because the market is still new. And when you talk to analysts and vendors and customers, and somebody says API security, everyone means something different, but no one's talking about that different thing that they mean. So I think it's super confusing, but I think there's a ton of really valuable stuff that you got to go. Jeremy walked through, kind of the risk inventory and risk thing. And I think the impact is driven by, how does this thing help the business the most? And that is a thing. If you're not crossing that divide between ops or development and security, you're never going to know. Like, you're just kind of guessing as a security person if you're not talking to the engineering and product teams. Like, what does this thing do? How does it help our business? And what happens if it goes down, or it goes or something happens to it, we have to take it offline or something? Those kinds of conversations largely oftentimes aren't being had. So I think there's a lot of great technology out there that is API focused, and you kind of have to be a lot of API focused because of the differences in how APIs work from a vendor standpoint. But that doesn't change what you need to be doing conversation wise inside of the organization to be effective at implementing the tools that you want to buy.
Can you expound upon that a little bit more for me? Because I think that part of the issue is that not all APIs are created equal, right? There's all kinds of different flavors. Some are externally facing, some are internally facing. Some of them are attached to microservices that, only one other API knows anything about. So maybe we have a different approach to security for that. Do we really understand what the landscape is that we're trying to protect? Because I would argue, that which you do not see, you will never protect in the first place.
Yeah, I heart this conversation. a lot of the time when you're talking about discovery and inventory, you're talking about public items, whether that's a Lambda or some kind of a server or EC2 that's deployed that's running an API. Hopefully they're not doing that. Containers. But all of that, kind of in our view, is defined in code somewhere. So someone wrote some code somewhere that is the API, and even more now today, the infrastructure that backs that API. So, we kind of think of inventory from the inside out, inventory from code to what does that code build and make? And is that a application, and is it testable, and where does it get deployed, and what is it? Now, in my brain, we should be testing all of those things, but helping prioritize, what is the most risky thing for the business, right? Is it a publicly available API that handles PHI? Probably spend a lot of time there, but also do everything else. Like test everything else, make sure you've got good grasp, and you don't have like a leaky bucket somewhere, because that's usually what happens is you spend a lot of time on the most valuable thing, and one other thing gets out, and suddenly you've got to pivot, right? An attacker finds that because they don't care how your business makes money. They care about foothold. So they're looking for, stuff that you're not thinking about, or stuff that they find out on the internet that has a problem, whether that's, pull data out of it or use some piece of data in there in another API, or handfuls of other things to get to what's valuable to them. And what's valuable to them is data and information.
Jeremy, do you agree with that? And I will bring up an old quote from, I think it was Frederick the Great, but he said, he who defends everything defends nothing. Is that the problem we're going to have with APIs?
Yeah. You don't know what you don't know. Scott touched upon it. You can't protect what you can't see. And I think this is a really common theme that we see a lot of times with prospects and customers in the industry in general. I know specifically for ThreatX, one of the top questions that almost any API security vendor will ask is, well, how many APIs do you have? We love that question because everyone has a different answer. Even the security professionals or engineering, maybe it's, we have 15 or we have 300 estimated. And then you realize, to Scott's point, most times they're only talking about their external or public facing APIs. They're forgetting about all the internal APIs that connect, different, maybe a CRM system to a payroll system, or this developer created an API for a specific purpose and forgot to decommission it, or didn't put the proper governance in how to create that, or the correct security configurations. And so on average, I always say the stat here within ThreatX, and Scott, I don't know if you've seen this too, but on average, we say somewhere between 8 and 10x more times more APIs that we actually find when we actually run a test or run a scan than the actual organization says. 8 to 10 times more. That's crazy. And I think when we think about that, there's so many different APIs. Again, the public, the external, the internal APIs. We have third-party APIs that may connect to systems or a supply chain, for example. So I think visibility, discoverability, you kind of mentioned before, there are different types of APIs. There's REST APIs that most of us are familiar with, but now we've seen this explosion of GraphQL APIs and how they kind of proliferate and how they help organizations. I actually saw a stat this morning that said by 2025, Gartner says that over 50% of APIs in production will actually be GraphQL. And so I don't think as an industry, we're just scratching the surface when we start talking about GraphQL APIs. We haven't even figured out how to protect the REST APIs that are out there, or the other types of APIs. And so we've got interesting challenges ahead of us. But that's part of the responsibility of Scott and I and the companies we work for and other API vendors to continue to preach the good word, help organizations consult with them. And again, a lot of it starts with the fundamentals, right? Am I designing my APIs? What is the intended use? What's the function of that? And first of all, where are they? How many do I have? So that's a lot of the starting point that we personally take.
Scott, are we in danger of falling into a trap because we maybe dismiss internal-facing APIs, but in my experience, today's internal-facing API is tomorrow's external-facing API, and people just kind of flip those things around without thinking about the security issues?
Yeah, you got a point there. I mean, today's internal API in a cloud land is quickly tomorrow's external API with a misconfigured ACL or a change in a route or something innocuous that is not even related potentially. So yeah, I think, the thing that's funny to me is we equate security things differently than we equate development things. So today, if you think about okay, we're doing API monitoring, and you just say that out loud, and then you go, and it's down, or it's throwing 400s, or it's throwing 500s. Who do we tell about that? We tell the engineering team about that, and they go fix it. And then we add this prepend of security issue, and we go tell a whole different team. And that like disparagement is how we get into this. He who protects everything protects nothing. That's literally what the engineering team is doing, except for everything that has the word security in front of it, which is a thing that we need to change. Right there's the classic stat that we talk about of 100 devs to every one security person, which I still think is generous. I think it's more like 200 devs to every one security person. The only way we're going to get really good at, specifically application security is really involving and engaging with these engineering teams so that they have some understanding and some tooling and some information to be able to make decisions on what's going on here, whether that's through testing or through feedback loops of what's happening in production. But pinning that all on the super understaffed, under-resourced security team, and then hoping that that's going to work in perpetuity it's a kind of a fool's errand. So, my thing is always about, like, if you feel like you're behind on API security and you feel like you're never going to catch up, and you're not going, okay, I need to rethink how I'm thinking about this, what teams I'm engaging, who's doing what work, and who's actioning what information, then you're, in my opinion, super far behind on being able to keep up with API security ever.
Mm-hmm. Jeremy, do you think this will become a bigger deal soon because we have these lovely generative AI models out there like ChatGPT, and they expose APIs, and people are using those to build things, and we've already seen some folks publish some vulnerabilities around those APIs exposed by those folks. So, it's one thing to be wrong. It's another thing to be wrong at scale. But what are we going to see here going forward?
Yeah, I actually think, interestingly enough, AI will help the business case of why we need to have API security and API protections. Because to your point, we've seen the explosion of, generative AI and other forms of AI, especially in the last year here. And I think with that, when we think about the models that AI are even built on and how developers are creating AI models, or how can I access, for example, like a chat GPT and integrate it into a platform or a technology or a service or whatever it might be, how is that being done? Bingo, APIs. And so I think when we think about the information even that we're generating or that we're actually feeding these AI systems, a lot of that information could be sensitive information. It could be names, email addresses, credit cards. It could be sensitive information to my company. There was a story that I just heard where, not picking on finance or CFO individuals, but there was a CFO at a company that uploaded all kinds of proprietary company documents to chat GPT, and it helps that they could create a summary so they could present at a board meeting. But we're posting financials that weren't publicly accessible yet. We're posting like information that are all, proprietary to this company, trade secrets potentially, in chat GPT. And so like, if somebody can use that leverage that model, I also think there's another concept here where a lot of these generative AI companies also need to look at their own security posture, right? That's probably a whole separate webinar, but looking at how they generate and what are they doing to protect their APIs and the information that they're collecting. Responsible AI, we hear that, and how is that information communicated to other systems or how it's consumed. A lot of it's APIs, and I think will only further kind of two things. It will definitely complicate it a little bit more, but I also think that there may be a better use case here for security teams or engineering teams to say, we actually need to invest in API security because we are leveraging AI and our consumers are, leveraging that as well for their use.
Scott, what do you think? Are we just waiting on a catastrophic event to make sure we have enough budget for API security?
Yeah, I don't know. How does LLM AI work its way in here? I think there's a couple of things. Jeremy mentioned continued proliferation of APIs, because all of those AI interfaces run on APIs. You could say that the prompt interface itself is an API, but it acts a little bit differently. So yet another evolution of API. But I think there's a couple different things. And one of them is, when you're talking about information that you're sending to those AI companies today, they're not using that information to train models. And that's no different than, say, an AWS who says, yeah, people who work in our data center don't have access to the data that are sitting on all the servers that are running all of the things. It's kind of a trust issue today. And the way that they can prove that trust issue is a different thing. But the other thing that goes along with it is AI is definitely helping people write code. Now, that has been proven to write bad code, technically, and create some other security problems. So being able to have a thorough program around, where do we use AI? How do we use AI? How do we test things that came out of AI to make sure that they're still solid, they're not introducing new problems, is all kind of part of the comprehensive program here. But AI is definitely going to make people's lives faster, easier. I don't know if you want to live in the fast lane, Mike. Probably not, but it's definitely not going to go away. So grasping on to, like, how does it work? How can we use it in our company? And how can I, as a security professional, help our engineering team use it safely? Super important.
It's going to be a traffic accident, so I'm going to be around to see how it happens, all turns out, and we'll see what goes on. But there's going to be a lot of rubbernecking for sure. Jeremy, we touched on responsibility here for a second, but I want to kind of come back to it a little bit more. It seems like the whole process is broken, to be honest. I mean, today, if there is a breach of the API, the security team is held responsible for it, and some of them might even go to jail because of it. And yet, they had nothing to do with the creation of the API, and they can't even fix the API if there's an issue. So do we need to rethink this whole thing a little bit? It seems like it's heading to somewhere on the border of the absurd.
I definitely think we need to continue I'll take the security perspective. From the security perspective, we need to continue to, Scott mentioned it earlier, but I hate to even say this, but it's almost like politics in a sense of, like, you need to cross the aisle. You need to go into engineering security professionals, because traditionally and historically, security has always been viewed as the stopgate. Oh, the security guys or girls are coming in and they're putting a pause on how we can complete this sprint or execute this code or create this new feature or product. And engineering, when we think about developers who think engineering, traditionally, they're not always thinking with a security mindset. They're not necessarily security professionals, right? That's the security team. But to your point, Mike, we've seen this huge gap where even who has budget, like whose budget is it coming out of? Is it the CISO? Is it the CIO? Is it the VP of engineering? And, I think right now we're in a world where that fluctuates. It's dependent on the organization, of course, and sizing and teams and resources. But we need to continue to fight the good fight in the sense that security needs to be part of that process, but not viewed as the stock gate. It's way easier said than done. I'll say that. But I do think when it comes to that, one of the experiences I had recently was actually doing an incident response tabletop exercise for an organization. Said, okay, you got hit with a DDoS attack. Now what? Just go. And so everyone's across the room, kind of going back to the Spider-Man meme again, where people are pointing with, like, well, who opened the ticket and who's making the call if we can shut the website down or when we can bring it back up, and who's going to the registrar, and then who's responding and looking into the the tactics and techniques or identifying who the attacker was. And it's real eye-opening when you do these in organizations. I actually recommend all organizations do this, where you can really start to formulate these processes, but programs. But again, it's figuring out the ownership and the responsibility of, okay, maybe security is going to own the investigation, the mitigation, the remediation of that. But engineering is also really, really important to this, to understand what's happening, to make sure that we can fix the code. And next time, we're putting in the right governance and compliance and security controls way earlier in the build process in the cycle, to make sure we're not at this situation where, for example, a credential stuffing or SQL injection attack potentially happens. So long way to go, but kind of the short answer there is we need to continue to have these conversations, bring engineering into security's world, security into engineering world, and hopefully we all become better for it.
All right. Scott, we have a question. I'm going to kind of paraphrase it to the best I can, but I guess the question is what value do you provide to the developer and the business as an API provider? And then, how do you align application security? And I guess the question is rooted in the assumption that we're not just building and deploying APIs ourselves, but we're invoking them, and other people are kind of surfacing those to us, and they have some obligation back to us to secure them. But how do we kind of do this across the whole ecosystem?
I'm blown away by this question. I sort of don't understand what direction this is going here, but because I'm reading the question as well, it's kind of incumbent upon each company that's making and producing APIs, whether that's almost always for customer and or business partner consumption to use to drive value, to be able to do their job at testing. And you can see that when you look at things like a SOC 2 report or a ISO report. You can see how the process of building software and testing and remediation is working in a company or not, and how mature it is. And so those kinds of artifacts help people understand, what is partner or vendor or other customer doing to be able to make sure that they're building strong software. And those kinds of artifacts are things that companies usually make public for consumption to be able to figure that out. And then, to your last point, I think we do ourselves a disservice when we say security people go to jail because of a breach. Security people don't get in trouble or get fired because of a breach. They get fired because of what they did after the breach. If you run around doing "I told you so," that'll get you fired. And CISOs go to jail for what they didn't do before the breach. So the negligence part of building process and procedure around how do we get together as a business to be able to tell what are we producing, how are we testing it to the best of our ability, and ensuring that we're publishing secure things. That's what gets CISOs in trouble. And so that, those kinds of things all roll together when you're talking about how do you provide developer business value as an API provider.
All right. Jeremy, you want to add anything to this
Did I
question?
just totally ramble that?
It's all right. It's fair because we can always ask the person who posted the question to keep amending it till we answer what it is she's looking for. But Jeremy, what do you think?
Yeah, no, I would agree with Scott there. I think, I always go back to, I had this heated debate recently where somebody was like, is API security actually even part of application security? Because I think when you think of applications in general, it's traditionally more of the engineering developer focus. And then we had this kind of concept of API security come up, and with vendors, right? Actually kind of making the field a little bit more confusing. And so with that being said, I think it's a blend of both worlds in the sense of that engineering, developers, security teams, and then especially management. I think that's another big thing that a lot of conversations kind of miss out on. It's not just necessarily the security analyst and the DevOps engineer. It's the CISO and the VP of engineering or the CIO need to also be communicating. Scott mentioned it great. The words that I got from him was transparency, communication, right? A lot of it comes down to the fundamentals again, where if that's not happening, we're never going to be in a cohesive world, right? Or the business is never going to be cohesive. It's always going to be finger pointing or blaming. It's like, well, we got breached because there was an issue, or the application was prone to an API security attack, whatever that might be, right? Business logic or credential stuffing or SQL injection or a DDoS attack, whatever it might be. And who's to blame for that? Is it security? Is it engineering? Is it everybody? Is it managers? So, I think there's a lot that's going to happen here. I think we're going to see, Mike, you actually brought this up earlier. Is there going to be one big bang effect that affects everybody, organization? Now everyone's like, nope, we need it. And I don't know if it's gonna be one big bang effect, but I will say that we're seeing it every day. Just this past month, there's a company that we probably have all signed up for to look at DNA and genetics that was just hit with a credential stuffing attack. And right now they're in the news as we talk right now. And we're figuring out, how are they responding? What are the action plans? Are they filling out their, now with the SEC regulations, right? Again, going down a rabbit hole here, but how are they trusting their investors, or what information they're providing and being open about that, transparency again. And so I think as we continue to kind of evolve here, as time goes on, and we're going to see more attacks for sure on API security, because again, it's the connected tissue. So all the data is sitting right there. All it takes is one little gap or crack within that API, and I'm in, and I can move laterally as well. So we got a long way to go, but I'm trying to stay optimistic as best as possible.
All right. Depending on what week it is, you'll get a report saying Bob is or is not your uncle, right? All right. Scott. What do you think of the maturity of our DevSecOps workflows to address all this? Because theoretically, these APIs are built by developers, but I wonder, because it seems to me a lot of the times the people who build the applications and the people who are building the APIs are not one and the same. They have different processes, and it just seems like that whole side of the equation is a little squishy.
Yeah, I think, if you liken this back to what kind of unit testing each of those teams is doing and what kind of integration tests each of those teams is doing, there's going to be different stuff in there. And then when the VP of engineering goes, no, we want to get standardized coverage on all of the things that we produce. So they go, we want to target like 85% unit test coverage. That's a great place to start. And then now you've got a better semblance of a program that is testing program. What we do is leave out security testing because it's hard, or the Spider-Man effect happens, and we're pointing at the security team like, yeah, well, they'll just take care of the security testing part of this thing. So, in my mind, making sure that we can provide tooling that makes sense, and you can build a program on top of it, and you can have kind of a standardized plan, and tons of security teams call this paved road, right? They go, we build paved roads for our teams in our DevSecOps programs, which is when you build in our pipeline, you get X, Y, and Z, and you should have good information that comes out of X, Y, and Z. And if you don't build in our pipeline, that would be the unpaved, bumpy dirt road full of potholes. And we're going to make it really hard for you to get software out the door. You could do it, but it's going to be the painful way. But being able to, fit tooling that helps people make decisions into CI/CD pipelines so that the DevSecOps program can function efficiently and effectively and help people get software out the door, but help people get the software out the door safely, is really, really important in a DevSecOps world. Where you get friction in that is when you start doing things like, I'm going to hide all the information, right? I'm building a DevSecOps pipeline, but it doesn't tell devs anything. It all comes to the security team, and it comes to ticketing, and then we got to get tickets prioritized and all that stuff. And I want developers making decisions, because they'll always make the wrong decisions because they don't care. Those kinds of things get you to quickly unwind a DevSecOps pipeline that it could be very effective.
All right. We have a quick question there from Solomon, but he wants to know if there's a webinar presentation, and I think we forgot to point people to that little handouts button at the top right-hand corner where you see that red dot. There should be some things for you guys to download and take with you, as we say. Jeremy, what's your sense of DevSecOps? I mean, can I get the security people involved in that process? Because earlier we were talking about, there's 1 to 100 developers, depending on what you call a developer and what you call a security person. But can they be part of the process, or how do we kind of make this happen?
Yeah, I think the concept is striving, right? That's what we're striving for, and hence the DevSec, the security part of the word DevSecOps, right? To include security part of this, the CI/CD build pipeline or the software development lifecycle. But Scott mentioned something, and I just want to kind of reiterate that, and it relates to this question, where I think security needs to go into these meetings or the program or this process, looking at as a test and a hook, not saying we're going to slow you down. Because as an engineer, I'm typically working in sprints. I'm saying, okay, I'm in a 2-week sprint. This is what I'm focused on. I get judged based upon my performance of work, based upon me producing this code. Hopefully, to Scott's point, hopefully safe code as well. But as security, like, we're coming in, we need to be part of the test, right? We need to be part of that continuous life cycle and that process, not necessarily slowing down what engineering developers are designed and paid to do, right? That's their job. And so the concept of DevSecOps and that whole area is striving for what we're kind of talking about, right? Bringing these teams together. There's another concept here where we can even kind of intertwine where I like to call purple teaming, right? So how do I take, from a security side, how do I take red teaming and blue teaming and blend that together? So, and that's just security focus, where, red teaming, can I test my APIs for misconfigurations or business logic flaws? Blue teaming, right? Am I responding correctly? Am I working with them? Do I have incident response plans? Am I doing threat hunting? And then how do I combine those teams together, that collaboration, to create what we call this concept of purple teaming, where we're cohesively working together, communicating transparency again, but building the right tools and processes in place to make sure that as a business, though, we're still efficient, we're still effective, and we're still, again, generating revenue. As security engineering, we need to understand that everything we're developing or everything we're securing is for the business to create revenue. And once we understand that concept, truly understand that concept, I think we'll all be better in our world. But yeah, definitely, Mike, to your point, security definitely needs to be part of that process. But again, it's not. I'll always say this: it's not a flip of a switch. It's somebody can come into a new CISO can come into an organization and say, "Yep, I'm building a DevSecOps programs. Here's the switch. It's on. Yep, here's the program on a piece of paper in a Word document. Done. We're done." No, it takes time, right? You got to build the trust. That's another concept there, right? Engineering needs to trust security. Security needs to trust engineering again, and it goes up to the top too, right? From the leaders of those departments to making sure they trust each other, and what we're doing is, part of the mission of the business as well.
All right, guys, before I shift topics, just want to remind everybody that you can ask questions yourselves in the chat and the Q&A button. Either one will work just fine. Scott, I believe it was a former president of the United States who said the 9 most dangerous words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." We're seeing a lot of regulations being discussed. A lot of things are starting to be crafted. I don't think they've passed into law just yet, but can we, to Jeremy's point, still develop software fast if we have all these regulations? And what do you think the impact of all this is going to be?
Yeah, it's a great question. Typically, when the government gets involved and we start making laws around technology, it doesn't go well, generally. And that's because things are moving so fast in software land, and they just don't move that fast in government land. It's hard to make kind of forward-looking laws that help there. You are starting to see, executive order, administrative orders, and CISA started to issue guidance, and the SEC is being a little more has a little more teeth in what they can and can't do to companies who are having a negligence issue. I think you're going to see more of it, right? That's the more and more customers and the public demands those kinds of activities and actions, whether that's investors or consumer or business to business customers. You're going to see more teeth coming out of the government, and it's maybe not a great thing, because they usually come with really screwed up ideas of how software gets built and what you should be doing. But that's what's going to happen if the industry doesn't take a better proactive approach at how do we protect this data, things like data minimization. What do we actually need to run the business? How are we protecting it in flight and in storage? And how are we getting rid of it when we don't need it anymore? Those kinds of things. And then, the big thing today is all about the program, right? The SEC is going, if you're not developing a program that has process and tooling that you can execute on and make sure that you're doing the right job with, that's problem number one. Next problem is if you developed a testing process, the very next order problem is, okay, now develop the fixing process. And then, security teams are usually pretty good at detect and respond, like the technology that they deploy into production to monitor APIs and block attacks and respond to attackers doing those kinds of things. But that's very reactionary. And if you're not helping build safer pathways to production, it's going to end you in hot water. And it's going to end more than one person in hot water. Today, it's the CISO. Tomorrow, it could be, the CEO and the VP of engineering and all the people that are responsible for what's happening in the organization. So I think, if something drastic doesn't change, we're going to see some teethier regulations come out from the government following kind of that SEC model today.
All right, Jeremy, what's your take? Do we just need an API security platform in every pot and call it even?
That would be the ideal situation right now. I'm just kidding. But no, to kind of just continue on and to answer that question there too, I think the regulation actually comes out in 6 days for all public companies. Like, it's now 100% into effect. I think it's December, don't hold me to it, but I think it's December 18th-ish, right around that date, where all public companies now, to Scott's point, of the SEC, right, if you got an incident or a breach that's material, you need to disclose this now. within the certain time frame that they've negotiated on or agreed upon. And so, in an ideal situation, what's interesting, and I was going to say this earlier, but Mike, it goes to your question, like, does everyone just buy an API security platform? And again, you check the box. I think there's a big concept here. There's two. One is when you look at traditionally API security breaches or headlines that have come out in the news from public companies or private companies, it's still the fundamentals of why they're breached, right? It comes down to a lot of the concepts of authorization, authentication, or the API that was created for X, Y, and Z and was completely forgot about. And it was public facing or external, and a hacker was able to crack the code or do some type of probing on it and find out in the error messaging and logging, I was able to manipulate that API. And now I have access to the entire database, or I can move laterally within that organization. And so when we think about these concepts, we see these major organizations making headlines, a lot of social media companies, a lot of athletic companies, e-commerce, banking, right? There's some major organizations, and you've got to assume, one has to assume, that they do have funding for application security and API security. That's what they provide, services that we use every day. And they're still getting popped. And that's just the public major companies we hear about. How about the mom and pop credit union down the bank that has 5 locations in just a small area in the Midwest? And, they're getting hit with credential stuffings or DDoS attacks on their login page and websites. And we're not necessarily hearing about that, right, in the news and in the headlines. And so I think when we think about this, we all need to take API and application security cohesively super, super serious, especially if you're providing services, which almost every business, that's how they generate revenue. And so it's going to be more than just getting a tool. I'll say that. It comes down to people, process, technology. And that's my second point, where the people still most important in my opinion. Yes, Scott and I both work for security vendors and we provide technology and help with process, but I still think it's people, right? We're seeing organizations understaffed. They don't have the 100 to 1, or to Scott's point, the 200 to 1. They don't have the security resources or even expertise to understand what's going on. How is my application API developed? How do I even protect it, right? How do I secure that? And so that's where I think a lot of it, where we need to continue to have awareness, right? We need to continue to train. We need to continue to preach out there about what are the threats, how does it affect our organization, and help the people, right? And that there's many different concepts of how we can do that, but I still think it comes down to people. People, process, technology. People's always first when we say that too. People, process, technology. And so, hopefully that helps.
Scott, where do people get the money for this? And I'm asking the question because is this something that I need to add to the budget and just kind of suck it up, buttercup kind of moment? Or is there other places I can not spend money to fund this?
Yeah, I think step one, maybe go visit one of the 5 branches of the mom and pop credit union Jeremy's talking about. Mom and pop with 5 branches? That's a big credit union, buddy.
It is.
We're starting to see budgets open pretty big, and if you look at the market, even software spend is kind of down or flat everywhere except for application API security, and it's still growing, and people are grabbing those budgets, and we're seeing a ton of it from some of these bigger organizations. And what they're paying for is, how do I be more efficient about my application and API security testing program? And so what you're seeing is less people buying tooling that you have to staff security teams for, right? So if I buy this one tool and this one tool and this one tool, and then when I get to the third one, I need to add another security headcount, those kinds of things are getting tossed on the floor pretty quickly. What you're seeing budget get it made for and kind of get freed up for is, how do we get software /value/revenue out the door safely, quickly? And if you're building business case, I 2 things. If you're building business case for that, CFOs have a much better inclination of, we should make some budget, get some budget cut out for that because of the revenue component of it, right? So if I can get more revenue, I got more money to spend. So if we can get more revenue faster, got more money to spend. And then the other component of that is some of this regulation stuff that's coming out for public companies, but making sure that you're, being efficient with how you're spending capital is super important. Like I have always said that as a CISO, if an engineering manager ever came to me and went, "Hey, this tool works really well for how we build software, and it tells us about security problems, and we'd like you to buy it," as a CISO, I would be like, "Here's the check. Let me know when we're all set," because that's so hard to not buy shelfware in security land, especially when you've got the hard problem of influencing people and process along with buying software. But when you do it the right way and you get it done, it is super valuable. Like, it's so worth the spend because you've got multiple teams aligned on one goal, and that's get safe software out the door to create value for our customers.
All right. Jeremy, what's your best advice to folks? Kind of like if you're sitting there and, we talked about a lot of things and kind of wrapping your arms around that people, process, and technology thing you were talking about. How do I get this motion started?
Yeah, I think the first thing is understanding, we kind of touched upon it a little bit, but understanding again, the core value to my business, right? How do I generate revenue? And then from there, building those use cases. To Scott's point, if I can tie things to business outcomes, if I can tie a tool or a technology or even staffing, because we need to protect this application because 90% of our revenue is linked to it. And if it went down, then, well, we're kind of screwed, right? And so I think like if you can start by understanding the business needs, then understanding where a lot of it comes down from the technology standpoint to the visibility again, right? Once you understand what I have, what's on my network, understanding how is it written, how is it coded, how is it secured, and then from there start to really build out those processes. But again, I want to harp on that. Majority times when we're seeing these security incident breaches, it's not actually this advanced super skilled hacker that was able to find a way and do some crazy Jedi stuff. It's coming down to the fundamentals again. The authorization. Who can authorize this API? Who can authenticate to it? Was this API even encrypted? Oh, oops, sorry, I created an API. It's public facing, and I have everyone's credit card number out there. With one easy manipulation of the API, I can access people's credit card numbers, your database, or whatever it might be. Understanding the basic fundamentals, again, going back to security and applying that to your API security process and program is super critical, right? Because no matter what tool or technology you have in place, those help for sure. But at the end of the day, right, a lot of this stuff comes back to the basics. So really understanding that, taking that mindset and that approach can really help get you kind of kickstarted, get you kind of the gears running, right? And then from there, it's building the use cases. Again, we talked about it before, security, reaching across the aisle, working with engineering, trust, communication, transparency. Those are key. Those are key.
All right. Scott, closing thoughts. What do you think?
What do I think? Just generally, as little as I can. No, it's all hard work. Everything we talked about today is hard work. You know what I mean? Like if you're trying to revamp an API security program and it's not working, it's hard work. And if you're trying to build one from scratch, it's hard work. But that's the whole thing that security teams, as our careers grow and we get paid for doing work, it's not whacking away at keyboards is where the value is. It's talking to people in the organization, helping build cohesion around how people are thinking about a security program and what we're doing in it. So yes, it is hard work. Yes, it is super worth it. And yes, you should also be working on that. And don't forget, whacking away a keyboard is fun. You can create more value with the other two pieces of the three-legged stool of organizational change, the people and the process.
All right. It's December of the year, so I'm going to add one more question to the thing, man. We're looking at 2024. Jeremy, API security prediction for 2024. Make one.
I was going to say, I was going to try to be optimistic, but I'm going to have to put on my Grinch hat here. Prediction, we will see more organizations being affected and having security incidences due to a lack of API security and the right configurations. I do think we've seen it traditionally. Some organizations over the last couple of years, I do think we're going to see more. And I do think, Mike, it goes back to your point. I think AI may have a component to do with this of just, Scott said it too, we're just moving so fast. The industry, everyone is just, we're kind of running around with our heads cut off, right? Produce more and more and more and more. And we're just doing it without kind of the consciousness of security. And again, I don't want to be so pessimistic, but I do think we're going to see a major API security incident that could affect multiple organizations, as we've seen with zero-day vulnerabilities, but affecting the API.
All right, do not pass go. Go directly to jail. All right, Scott, what's your prediction?
I'm gonna take the opposite side. I'm gonna say that you're gonna start hearing more success stories from organizations about getting tighter alignment with engineering teams and building better programs. That's not going to be in the news because no one's going to be like, "Hey, check out this kumbaya story of engineering and security come out." But I think you're going to see people start talking about it at conferences and things. It's been around for long enough. People know they've got to influence the three pillars there. I think we're going to start hearing some of those success stories coming out next year.
All right, from your lips to God's ears, as they say. All right, Cody, take us home, and thank you all for spending some time with us.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. And thank you, Scott and Jeremy, for joining us back on Techstrong Learning. It's always a pleasure speaking with you whenever we do have you on.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
So a couple of final notes for our audience. This session was recorded, and we will be sending you the recording as soon as it becomes available. You can also find it living on the Security Boulevard website at securityboulevard.com/webinars, and it will be in the on-demand section waiting for you shortly. So we will be reaching out to 2 of our engaged attendees to send out some $50 Amazon gift cards. So thank you all for your questions today. And if you didn't send in any questions and maybe you were a little quiet in the chat, you can still be eligible for this giveaway if you fill out our post-webinar survey. That is in the handout section. I'll go ahead and pin it to the top of the chat. So Scott and Jeremy, thank you so much for joining us. Mike, thank you for keeping us on track as you always do. We really appreciate everyone's time, and we hope to see everyone at a future Techstrong Learning experience. Have a great rest of your day, and you may all now disconnect.
See you guys.